Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 23rd of June of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. Of course, we're going to start with Ukraine, and first we're going to talk about the mobilization process in Ukraine. If you remember, a few days ago we discussed that the first towns, the first settlements that announced the local mobilization were Ivano-Frankivsk. This settlement is located on the western part of Ukraine. The second city was Kyiv. Today we got in the morning update that Ukrainians continue mobilization in Chernihiv, and right before I start making this video, the Ukrainians announced another wave of mobilization in Lvov. Basically, the Ukrainians are planning to mobilize another 100,000 soldiers, and if you ask me, if I give you my opinion, I make my own calculations of Ukrainian losses, and by the 23rd of June of 2023, the Ukrainians have already lost around 200,000 soldiers killed. And my calculations are based on the Ministry of Defense report, so of course it's up to you to believe or not these numbers, but anyway, we see that Ukrainians are making one wave of mobilization after another. Now we're going to the south, and we're going to start this discussion, the situation on the ground from Black Sea and Crimea. The United States of America launched another RQ-4B Global Hawk drone. Currently, this drone is flying above the Black Sea, trying to analyze and to get as much as possible information from Crimea, and the most important, from supply and support roads that goes from Crimea to the Zaporozhye and Kherson region. If you remember, yesterday the Ukrainians made the missile attacks using the storm shadows, and as a result of those attacks they managed to damage the bridges that goes from the Crimea to the South Zaporozhye area in Kherson region. Today the Russians published the photo that as a result of engineering things they managed to build pontoon bridge. Currently, by let's say 8 p.m. of the local time, the 23rd of June day, we got just one photo confirmation of one pontoon bridge. I believe that the Russians are going to build more, because they understand the value and they understand the importance of supply and support road during the Ukrainian counteroffensive. From the other side, we understand that Ukrainians are going to continue bomb and shell this territory using the Storm Shadow missiles. Furthermore, the governor of this territory, of Kherson territory of Saldo, reported that the bridges were damaged heavily, and the Russians didn't expect that the damage were going to be so heavy. Furthermore, the Ukrainians launched another massive missile attack to the south. There were explosions in the settlement by the name of Genichesk. Currently, this settlement is the capital of Kherson region of Russian Federation. If you remember, the Kherson used to be the capital of that region, but after the Russians retreated, they moved the capital to this small settlement, and today there were explosions. As I understand, I believe that Ukrainians made another missile attack, and probably the Russians managed to shut down missiles above the territory of this settlement, or the Ukrainians were attacking the settlement trying to get the Russians' reserves and the positions of Russian forces. Now we are moving to the combat line, and we're going to discuss the first discussion with Petikhatki. Today the Ukrainians published the video of their positions in the vicinity of the western part of Petikhatki. We remember this tank that got into trap and fell from the road, and the Ukrainians couldn't do anything and to evacuate this tank. Currently this territory is under Russian control, and basically the Russians probably managed to find the mobile phone from the killed or wounded Ukrainian soldiers on this ground, and currently they're publishing the video of that situation in the vicinity of Petikhatki. The Ukrainians continue accumulation of their forces on the northern edge of this settlement. They're moving more and more reserves, and the Russians expect for some kind of activation of another offensive operation from the Ukrainian side within the next few hours, or even within the next night, within the upcoming night. Now we are moving further to Orekhov bridgehead. Today we got a lot of very interesting updates from this territory. The Western sources are saying that the Ukrainians, as a result of another push in this very heavy push on this bridgehead from Novodanilovka in direction of Robotina, from Novotokmachka, Malotokmachka in direction of Verbova, the Ukrainians managed to penetrate the first defense belt of the Russians and to capture the bridgehead and to capture the fields between on this red cloud. For example, the live UA map shows the progress of the Ukrainian sources of Ukrainian side. Live UA map based their like updates on the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine reports, but the thing is that the Russian sources confirms that Ukrainians did have some progress, and some Russian sources are saying that Ukrainians even managed to answer the first trenches, defense belt, the first trenches on the north of Robotina. If this information is correct, if this piece of information is correct, so basically the Ukrainians will continue offensive operation, because the first thing that they need, the most important thing they need, is to achieve a significant media victory. And to tell that the Ukrainians like captured fields, it's not the kind of media victory they want to achieve. But if the Ukrainians are able to show the picture from the north of Robotina, somewhere in the vicinity of, let's say, road sign where we can find the title of the settlement Robotina, of course, in this case this would be a significant media victory for the Ukrainians. And I expect, and the Russians confirms this piece of information, that Ukrainians are planning to start massive attack during the upcoming night. The Russian officers on the ground are saying that blood goes on the ground like rivers. A lot of losses from the Ukrainian side, but they're not planning to stop. They're continue pushing, and this night, I repeat myself, they're going to repeat another offensive and storming operation. The Russians reported that during the previous night they bomb and attack. During the previous days, from the 4th of June till 23rd of June, the Russians made massive missile attack, and there were massive bombing of the Ukrainian positions in Orekhov. The Russians were using massively guided bombs, missiles, and basically on this video you can see how the Russians were attacking the Ukrainian positions in industrial zones on the southern part of that settlement. There were a lot of explosions, a lot of areas with the smoke, as you can see on this episode, that the Russians attacked some industrial area, probably where the Ukrainians were hiding their armored vehicles and so on. The Russians haven't reported about any losses from the Ukrainian side during those attacks. Furthermore, the Russians reports that they use that not the guided bombs is not the only weapon they use massively. Helicopters and helicopter support from Berdyansk to Orekhov currently is another massive event on this part of the front line. The Russians published another video of damaged and destroyed armored vehicles by helicopters, by new missile that the Russians use in those helicopters by the name of Stugna. For example, on this video we can see how the Russians attacked another tank. On this video we see how the Russians were attacking armored vehicle, and on this video we can see how the Russians destroyed another armored vehicle somewhere in the field. So a lot of tanks, a lot of armored vehicles currently were destroyed by the Russian helicopters. And today there was another video, but probably from the Vimivka tactical bridgehead, where the Russians were continuing destroying the Ukrainian tanks. On this video probably the Russians destroyed either Leopard or maybe T-72 tank or something like this, and the soldiers that were in the vicinity of those armored vehicles. A lot of losses the Russians are making to the Ukrainians using the helicopters. Now let's move next. The Russians reported that they repelled few attacks in the vicinity of Gulyapolia. The Ukrainians continue sending their commando squads and platoons, but all those attempts were repelled by the Russians. Now we are moving to the Vremivka tactical bridgehead. The Ukrainians continue accumulation of their forces in the vicinity of Makarovka, and today we got another deployment update. According to the Western maps, the Ukrainians have redeployed 501st Marine Battalion of 36th Marine Brigade. The main positions of 36th Marine Brigade is in the vicinity of like Avdiivka, Donetsk, somewhere in the north of Pervomaiska, but as we see, just the battalion was moved to reinforce Ukrainian positions in the vicinity of of Vremivka tactical bridgehead. The Blaga Riba reports that the Ukrainians continue accumulation forces and continue attack the Russian positions in the vicinity of Gulay Pole, Orekhov, Vremivka tactical bridgeheads. All those attacks and all those attempts from the Ukrainian side were repelled by the Russians without any progress, but the Ukrainians continue accumulation and they will continue attacking the Russians on this bridgehead as well. The Russians reported that the total losses of the Ukrainians on the South Donetsk and Zaporozhye area were around 130 soldiers, 15 armored vehicles, including 5 tanks and 3 artillery systems. As you can see, the level of losses of the Ukrainians since the beginning of the counter-offensive operation is the lowest. So basically, we say that by the end of this week, the parties took a decision, at least the Russians and the Ukrainians, either the Ukrainians took a decision to slow down and probably to regroup a little bit, but as we discussed today, the Ukrainians, after a small regrouping, relaunched their offensive operation, and tomorrow we expect more numbers and bigger numbers, at least when talking about the southern Orekhov area. Now we are moving to Avdiivka. The Russians reported that as a result of fierce fightings, they managed to repel Ukrainian attacks in the vicinity of Mariinka, in the vicinity of Pervomaiska, and in the vicinity of Krasnogorovka, to be more precise, in the vicinity of Berdychi. The Ukrainians were attacking from this direction, trying to cut this small salient because this is the hill, and the Russians use these positions as the hill and as their eyes to navigate the Russian artillery. Furthermore, the Western sources maps published very interesting picture, at least the deep state map, showing us that as a result of Ukrainian counter-offensive operation, they managed to capture these forest lines. It's 500 square meters. Very difficult to understand the value and the progress of the Ukrainian side, particularly on this direction. I don't understand the value, but maybe time will tell us the real purpose and the reasons of the Ukrainians to attack in front of fortified positions in the vicinity of Staromykhailovka and Mariinka. We'll see. For now, I don't understand the reason of that attack. Now we're moving further to Artyomovsk. We haven't received any big update from this bridgehead. The thing that the Russians reported, they destroyed the ammo depot of 118th Territory Defense Brigade. Basically, the main position of that brigade was or is in the vicinity of Cherkasy. This is also a newly created brigade. So probably the Ukrainians have redeployed the 118th Brigade in the vicinity of Artyomovsk to reinforce forces on this area, because as we know, the main purpose of territory defense brigades is to hold the ground and not to allow the Russians to attack and so on. There were in the vicinity of Artyomovsk a lot of brigades that took part in the battle in defense operation of Bakhmut. All of them were pretty damaged. Of course, they need some rest, they need some time. So maybe that was an act of some kind of regrouping and replacement process and rotation process, and damaged brigades in Artyomovsk area, brigades like 3rd Assault Brigade, like 93rd Brigade, like 5th Assault Brigade, 80th Assault Brigade were replaced and currently are replacing by the Ukrainians with territory defense forces. Now we are moving further to the Seversk bridgehead. Currently, this is the most intensive bridgehead. The Ukrainians and either the Russians and the Ukrainians attacks each other on the combat line from Tierny to Sporne. Currently, another source confirmed that the Russians managed to develop their bridgehead on the south of Sporne, and they're moving closer to the fields between settlements like Veselaya, Vymka, Ivanodarivka, and Sporne. If you expect that the Russians will attack somewhere in these directions very fast, you are completely wrong. The thing is that this bridgehead between settlements, between this Ukrainian defense belt from Veselaya, Vymka, Ivanodarivka, and Sporne is minefields, and this area is completely the same, and the situation on these fields is the same as the situation in the Bradley Square on the Orekhov front line. And we saw the results of Ukrainian attacks when they were getting just minefields and were destroyed. Basically, the Russians are not going to do the same. They will move very slowly, step by step, and the most obvious direction of the Russian attack, they will move along the forest line to the north and basically in direction of Ivano-Darivka. I don't see any other movements because from this bridgehead to the west, just the fields without any possibilities to move with armored vehicles, and the only thing Russians can do is to move along the forest lines. But anyway, we see that the next target of the Russians is to complete the story of Sporne and somehow, maybe somehow, to solve the issue and the situation with Vesele. The Russians need to cut this settlement, and they need to push the Ukrainians from the south on Siversk bridgehead, because there are timings. We see that the Russians continue advancing on the Kupyansk and Kremenaya front lines, so they just need to be a little bit in a hurry. They need to hurry a little bit. The Russians published another video of bombing and shelling Ukrainian positions in Bilogorovka, and today the Russians bloggers, the Russians military experts and officers on the ground, probably for the third or fourth time in a row, confirmed the situation that as a result of fierce fightings, a storming operation and so on, the Russians finally managed to clear this industrial zone that located on the east of Bilogorovka and the landfields of Bilogorovka, and to finally capture this industrial area and this fortification. We're talking about this territory. Currently, I still haven't updated this map. We need to wait a little bit more to get 100% sure information, but Rybar, the Russian military expert and blogger, confirms that this industrial area was captured by the Russians. Furthermore, according to him, the Russians continue attacking the Ukrainians all over the combat line, from Tarskoye to, let's call it, to Grigorovka, and the Russians continue advancing. For example, during the previous 24 hours, according to that blogger, the Russians managed to capture at least 15 strongholds somewhere on the combat line. The losses of the Ukrainians were around 200 soldiers during the previous 24 hours, and furthermore, he added that, as we discussed, 42nd Mechanized Brigade was almost completely destroyed and defeated during the battles on this front line during the previous days. The Russians reported that as a result of fierce fightings on this bridgehead, the Ukrainians lost 90 soldiers, 6 armored vehicles and 4 artillery systems. By the way, the total losses of the Ukrainians on Donetsk front line are almost the same. Also 90 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles and 2 artillery systems. Anyway, we see that the Ukrainians accumulated significant number of their forces on this bridgehead, and we expect the next few days and probably weeks very fierce fightings. And as I understand, currently the Russians got some initiative, and they will continue doing this. And as we discussed in the previous videos, some sources, some Russians, some Western sources are saying that the Russians managed to maintain this bridgehead and to establish control over these fields, and they got very close to the Zhiribets river, and currently the Russians can use tanks to attack the settlements like Nevskaya, the settlement like Novodarova, Terny and Yampolovka. So we expect the activation of the Russians on this front line as well. Now we are moving to the Kupyansk front line, and we got a lot of very interesting update from this territory as well. During the previous days, we discussed that the Russians managed to complete the clearing of the forest that located on the south of Liman, and basically the Russians managed to half encircle Sinkovka. And today, some Russian sources reported that Ukrainians started regrouping and started sending significant number of operational reserves in direction of Kupyansk, just with one purpose: to slow down the Russians. And the same sources are saying that as a result of fierce fightings and advances of the Russians to the south, the Russians managed to optimize the structure of their forces, and they also managed to secure the flanks, and that allowed the Russians to cross Oskol River at another area and to continue develop the bridgehead on the Ukrainian side of Oskol River. If you remember, during the previous months, according to the Russian sources, the Russians managed to capture the bridgehead on the south of Dvorechne. Later we got update that the Russians managed to capture the settlement by the name of Novomlinsk, and today we got another report that the Russians managed to cross the Oskol River at third place and to establish the third bridgehead. So basically now, as I understand, the Russians have created a very powerful, significant bridgehead on the Ukrainian side of Oskol River, and probably they have completed the preparation before upcoming offensive operation somewhere in Kupyansk region, maybe to the north, because the Russians currently do have possibilities to attack to the north. Maybe the Russians are trying to develop to the west in direction of these settlements like Velika, Shapkovka, and from this settlement to attack to the south, trying to encircle Kupyansk. We see that the Russians are ready. Furthermore, today we got a very interesting update from Kharkiv area. Today, these Kharkiv and Belgorod region. Today, these days, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, Sergei Shoigu, visited this territory, Belgorod, with inspection. He had some meetings, he inspected the forces, the fortifications, the forces on this territory, the equipment, armored vehicles, and so on. I'll remind you that a few weeks ago, we got report that Wagners were redeployed in Belgorod area, and also the special unit Akhmat was redeployed on this bridgehead. So as you can see, based on a piece of information we managed to collect during the previous 3 weeks, at least 3 the most powerful and the most important persons of Russia have visited this territory. I'm talking about Evgeny Prigozhin. Probably he is currently in this region. Furthermore, the Sergei Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, visited this territory, and Akhmat's special unit was redeployed in this direction as well. So we see that something very big is going to happen, because too many attention to this bridgehead from very important persons of the Russian Federation. As you can see, the head of Ministry of Defense took a decision to inspect by himself and to see everything with his own eyes, and there are a lot of rumors that the Russians may try to start offensive and storming operation of Kharkiv. The special unit Akhmat will try to encircle this settlement from the west, and like Russian army with Wagners will do the same from the east. Maybe this is speculation, maybe this is just another Russian media campaign trying to force the Ukrainians to keep some reserves on this bridgehead. But when talking about the Ukrainians today, we got the final confirmation of some redeployments. The 60th Mechanized Brigade was redeployed finally. This brigade was redeployed before, maybe a week ago or even more, but today we got like the final confirmation, the Western deployment map about this event, that 60th Mechanized Brigade was redeployed in this direction. As you can see, something very important is going to take place on the Kupyansk front line, and basically, if you ask my opinion, the current attack in direction of Liman front line is another support operation from Russian forces. If you remember, when the Russians were storming Bakhmut, they did the same. They started this support operation in Liman. The level of loss of the Ukrainians was very heavy, but that allowed the Russians to force a lot of reserves from the Ukrainian side to redeploy in these directions with one purpose: to slow down and stop the Russians. Currently, as I understand, the Russians are doing the same. They're attacking in this direction with one purpose: to force the Ukrainians to send strategical reserves to this territory, to be more precise, the forces of newly created 9th and 10th military corps. Meanwhile, the Russians are finishing their preparation before the greatest battle of Kharkiv area, and as we can see, the most powerful and the most valuable forces of the Russian side are going to take part in this operation. Furthermore, don't forget that the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that the Russians have almost completed creation of strategical reserved army, and maybe the Russians are going to use this army also in the vicinity of Kharkiv. And the number of the forces that the Russians have already redeployed or are planning to redeploy in this area, including the reserved army, is more than 100,000 soldiers. The number is around 150,000 soldiers, including Wagner's reserved army and special unit Akhmat, or even more. And that's it for another important update. One more thing. Another important update is that the Russians reported, very reliable sources reported, that for some reasons the Russians started accumulation and creation of very interesting brigade or very interesting unit in the vicinity of Rostov-on-Don, and they're saying that this is going to be a squad or half a brigade, few battalions, 3 battalions of just of special forces, not mobilized forces, not some kind of, I don't know how to say, volunteers and so on. This is going to be professional, the most professional Russian soldiers. The number of this squad is going to be 1,500 soldiers. And basically, as I see the Russians, if this information is correct, if this piece of information is correct, that means that the Russians are planning to make a very powerful special operation of the level of the Battle of Gostomel. So something like this. And if you ask me, the only purpose and the only destination that the Russians can use for these forces, as I see, is to attack Odessa, using these special forces with like 1,500 soldiers, using helicopters. We know that there are a lot of helicopters in the south of Ukraine. So it's speculation from my side, based on the information we got from the open source. And now that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.